Now from Rachel Kramer, who is a licensed clinical psychologist with experience working with families with complex medical needs. Rachel, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your perspectives on how families can take care of themselves, how caregivers can take care of themselves, and how the provider community can support that as well.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you to everybody who just spoke. Christina, Jennifer, and Helena, those were just incredibly powerful and moving presentations that you just made. And I thought it was really deeply meaningful to hear you speak about your families and your experiences. Let me tell you just a tiny bit about myself. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice in Concord, Massachusetts. I've been in practice for 26 years, and my practice is split about half the time I work directly with children from the ages of 5 until 23, so some who are young adults, and then about half of my time I spend working with parents doing parent coaching and consultation. And I just want to begin by talking a little bit about, acknowledging just all of the stressors that are entailed in parenting a child with a progressive illness. And I think we've just heard a lot about that, just the challenges of managing medical and developmental care for children, of facing and managing fear and uncertainty, lack of control, and also acknowledging, the stressor involved in having the bandwidth to attend to the physical, social, and emotional needs of other children, if you have other children that you're parenting. And in addition, it's important to acknowledge that over the past 2.5 years, everybody has been parenting in the context of the global pandemic and all of the challenge and worry and uncertainty related to that situation. So, when I think about that, I think, how can I possibly ask you then to spend 15 minutes thinking about parental well-being? And a thought that came to mind is that in psychology, we often talk about the complexity of holding opposing ideas or emotions at the same time. And a useful phrase to describe that is to say two things are true. So I think in this instance, we can say two things are true. At times, it may feel really unimaginable to focus on yourself as a parent. And we know it's important to find ways to do just that. In order to be a calm and robust leader for your family, parents need to prioritize time to care for their own physical and emotional needs. Psychologists know that children do best when they have the presence of a calm and loving adult in their lives. And it's incredibly difficult to be that person if you haven't attended to your own well-being. When I think about the topic of parental well-being, I think about acknowledging the important basics of physical and mental health. And I've heard a lot of people speak about the challenges of sleep. And so I wrote adequate sleep on here, knowing that we have the context of sometimes that's just not possible, but just thinking about these building blocks when you can, and knowing that the building blocks of good physical health help support emotional health for parents as well. So I often speak with parents about, if there's a small action they can take, every day or most days to support their own well-being, that will support the psychological and emotional health of the whole family. And, this is not an exhaustive list, it's an sample list. And I just want to acknowledge that you may be in a place right now where your child's physical needs demand every moment of your attention. So every parent who's listening right now is in a different situation. And what I hope is, if right now you can't focus on these kinds of ways to support your well-being, that you'll be able to at some point come back and think more about your own well-being. In the meantime, I find a helpful frame to be thinking about well-being snacks. So rather than a whole meal, rather than spending a half an hour focusing on well-being, can you take 5 or 10 minutes? So if you're somebody that likes to go hiking, that may not be realistic, but can you take a 5-minute walk? If you're a person who would enjoy reading a book but doesn't have time for that, can you, a couple of times a week, read one poem? If you like crossword puzzles, can you just play Wordle a few times a week? So just thinking about small ways that you can take moments to care for yourself, and particularly the idea of self-advocating with friends and family members, and setting some clear boundaries. So texting something like, I have 5 minutes right now, are you free to catch up? You're really asking people for what you need. And I think sometimes focusing on well-being for parents means thinking flexibly. If what you need to do is to let your child, watch something or play on a screen for a few minutes so that you can take a couple of minutes to talk to a friend or to do something for yourself, sip a cup of tea. Um, I would encourage you to frame that action as a way of caring for yourself and your well-being, rather than feeling guilty about taking the time to do that. I think another important part of supporting parental well-being is thinking about your own information gathering style and the style of other family members or caregivers who spend time with your child. So as you think about all the complexity of diagnosis, procedures, complications, there are going to be some parents who are information seekers and who are really going to scour the internet, and that's helpful to them to gather as much information as they can. And there are other people for whom compartmentalizing and maybe just focusing on the child who's in front of you in the moment is the most helpful way for that individual to move forward. It's not that one of these styles is right or wrong. It's just that it's useful to be aware of your own style and then to communicate about what works best for you with the other adults in your life. And in particular, if you're parenting with a partner and you have different styles, to talk about that and to balance. So if you have one person who's an information gatherer, who's got a lot of information, and another person who prefers to compartmentalize, to be able to say, hey, before bed, I don't want to hear about the things that you learned in your internet searches today. That's stressful for me. To try to find the time to talk about that. I think it's useful to think about your grieving style. And in this, I mean grief in the context of, I think actually all of the parents spoke beautifully about this idea of, hopes and dreams a parent may have, let's say when they're pregnant, and then the grief entailed in receiving a really devastating diagnosis. I think about the slide that Christina just presented with emotional challenges, and that speaks to this, I think, really beautifully. So, just to consider that you need time to process, you need time to grieve. If you're parenting with a partner, you'll need to gain some insight into each other's styles of grieving and to communicate about where you are emotionally on a given day of the week. And I think also to feel comfortable self-advocating with the medical team. If there's information that you're presented with that feels overwhelming, to say, I need a moment to think about this, or I want to ask questions, but first I'm just feeling such strong emotion hearing what you've just told me. Everybody perceives and reacts to this type of shocking and upsetting news in a unique way based on their past experience, their cognitive style, their culture, their environment, their knowledge, and be respectful of your own style and try to develop the ability to self-advocate for what it is that you need. What I've seen in my work with families is that very often processing a child's illness means recalibrating what you're hoping for. So that can be a highly individualized process. You may have hopes, say during a pregnancy, or hopes in a child's first few days or weeks of life. And then after receiving a diagnosis, often parents are hoping just for different sorts of things. And it's useful to consider that individually and then also communicate, if you have a shift in perspective, communicate that to family members or to other people who are part of caring for your child. Something that I referenced earlier in talking about meeting basic physical and emotional needs was the idea of connecting with a community of people. And that might be extended family, and it might be friends who are playing a role in supporting your well-being. And I think, for some people have a large community of family members and or friends who support them. Other people maybe only have a smaller group with whom they're close. But giving some thought to who are the people in your life that provide a supportive and steady presence for you. And I really encourage you to self-advocate with those people, the people that you're close to, about how they can best support you. So, are there one or two people with whom you feel comfortable being really open about your situation? So not only the logistics, we went to the hospital and this happened, but also your hopes and maybe your deepest, darkest fears. really explaining the illness to a few people, again, whether it was family or friends, so they know what you're dealing with. And something else that I've seen in some of the families I've worked with children who have very serious illnesses is that parents actually get to this stage where they're functioning what from the outside looks really effectively. They set up systems, they maybe have some outside supports, maybe a family member is coming in to help them. And what I see is that those parents have gotten really good at coping with an extremely difficult situation. But an outsider that doesn't have that awareness of how hard it is to build those systems might say, oh, they have a child who's ill, but they're doing great. So I think being able to be honest with people about how hard it is, how good you are at doing something really, really hard is important. And then self-advocating. Some families like it when a close friend just is physically present with them, can just come over and be in the house. I know that's more challenging. It has been more challenging in the context of COVID, but can come over and just be in the house and just be there as a calm, kind presence. You may feel like sometimes you want a person in your life, a family member or a friend, to talk with you more about what's going on with them, to distract you, to help you think about other things other than what's happening with your child who's ill. And some people may need you to almost to give them permission to say, no, I really do want to hear about your child. This gonna help me to hear your stories, to hear about what your child's doing, what your family's up to. And then separate from that, I encourage you to accept offers of help and really think about, if people want to drive a sibling to school or offer to cook something for you, to think about how you can allow yourself to let those people in and let them help you. Another aspect of well-being I want to address is just the role that social media plays in parents' lives. Many of you may have read the really disturbing studies that talk about the use of Instagram in teenage girls and how it's linked to depression and anxiety. And we don't really have data about the impact of social media on parents, but anecdotally, we know that social media is a real mixed bag, and it can be fascinating. It can also be really toxic. So I just encourage you to, ask yourself some questions. Think about, let's say you're following people who appear to have the perfect child or a perfect family or the perfect life. Is that helping you, or is that, maybe it helps because it feels like it's a real fantasy, and that it's useful for you to look at that fantasy, and maybe it's really dragging you down and is a habit or a pattern that is not feeding you or supporting you. I've had lots of parents, just with all the different types of disasters that have occurred throughout the world, who get really stuck in doom scrolling, in this idea that they're on their phone and reading about something upsetting that's happened and then clicking on the related article. And it becomes so automatic. I think often we don't even realize that we're doing it, and we don't realize that it's making us feel worse and worse and worse, and again, not serving us. And similarly, I have some parents in my practice who follow parenting, experts, some of whom have real expertise and some of whom don't. But sometimes that the advice that they're listening to can make them parents feel really guilty. So as opposed to supporting them. So I encourage you to really analyze the pros and cons of your own social media diet and consider whether it would be helpful to make some changes in the service of your well-being. And, this strategy, point 3 here, this strategy of setting a daily time limit on some apps on your phone, some parents have found that really useful, like a time limit on Instagram or TikTok. And keep in mind that particularly, depending on the ages of children in your home, thinking about limiting your social media or structuring it is good for your well-being. It's also a really good model for your child. I want to just spend a moment thinking about some kind of cognitive behavioral strategies to coach yourself through stressful moments. I work with families sometimes who will tell me after the fact about a really unbearable moment with the medical team. And I think it can be helpful to have a script in mind, this idea of like, this is stressful, but I'm not alone. And I can tell my partner, my parent, my sibling about it soon. Or if you're having a really challenging moment with your child, I'm a good parent having a tough time and I'm going to do my best. And then giving yourself some scripts for self-soothing. So the idea of, I'm going to take slow, deep breaths and then reevaluate. This is an intense moment. I'm going to close my eyes and count to 20, just slowing yourself down and giving yourself that grace. And finally, when I talk with parents caring for a child with a chronic illness, I find it really helpful to remind parents about the principles of self-compassion. And these are the 3 principles. And in particular, notice that second one, this idea that I just implore you to try to treat yourself with the same tenderness that you would offer to a close friend. And I think that, Jennifer was talking about everybody's going to make mistakes, and she spoke about that so eloquently. And, if you make a mistake or a misstep, and you find the inner voice, like you're beating yourself up about it, how could I have done that? That was careless. I'm the worst parent, whatever that inner voice is saying, think about if it were a friend who were in the same situation, what would you say to that friend? You would say to your friend, oh my gosh, that's so hard. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's really painful. What can I do to support you? So can we treat ourselves, can parents treat themselves and with that same kindness and compassion that they would offer to a close friend? I'm going to stop my share, and I just want to say thank you to everybody for inviting me to speak with you. It feels like a real privilege to be here.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It was really helpful to see those really tangible practices reinforced. And I love that piece of self-compassion, of treat yourself the way you would encourage a close friend to treat themselves. I know that when my son was alive, I took that a step further to treat myself with the same level of attentiveness and care that I was giving to him, understanding that when you're a caregiver, it is such a symbiotic relationship. And I really just appreciate your words of advice for folks to be as self-aware as possible about their own preferences and needs in all of these domains, because we do get so much information about what it should look like, but we're all unique individuals. So paying attention to our own needs in those domains is really important. The other thing that I would offer is it's a skill set to learn to kind of ask for what we need once we've become aware of it. And it's also a skill set to be clear about what we don't need. And I think that caregivers very broadly are just expected to have this incredibly expansive capacity, and we just don't. And no is a full sentence. No, thank you is also a full sentence. And so I would just encourage all the caregivers on this call to really, really honor your boundaries for your own capacity, because you are doing really, really hard work every single day. And Rachel, I appreciate you being here to speak to that. I'm going to pause really quickly in case anybody would like to pop a question in the Q&A. Anna asked, Rachel, do you recommend any books, blogs, podcasts, etc., which would be directed towards parents of special needs kids, focusing on support, some of the support strategies you talked about?
And that's such a great question, Anna. And the answer is not off the top of my head. You can shoot me an email, or I can email some resources to Sophia or somebody else at Kramer Foundation that they can distribute.